All right, we are going to do the tracing for Romans 2, 1 through 5. So again, we have propositions, and these propositions are broken up into dependent or independent clauses. And we're noticing, observing, and connecting words or conjunctions and things like that that would key us into the propositions and the relationship between clauses again. So again, we start with kind of the smallest, most obvious connections and build out to more broader conceptual ideas. The first one you can see is in 1b and 1c of Romans 2, 1 through 5. While judging one another, you condemn yourself, for you who judge practice the same things. That is just a simple grounds connection. Okay. Now, the relationship between 1b, c, and verse 2 is simply a series. We're just moving, they're just advancing the arguments. Notice the and clause, all right? Verse 3, I have one large, just one of its own sentence. And then we can move down to verse 4, A and B. Notice there's a because between 4A and 4B. So that's just a grounds there. All right. And then the relationship between verse 3 and verse 4 is just a series. Notice the connection is just or. There's no grounding phrase or therefore concessive language. It's just continuing the argument without any major significant relationship between the clauses. It's just the next step in Paul's argument. All right. Now we can begin to back out, and I think broader conceptual relationship between clauses is kind of the next step. What I would say, what I would argue for, is that the relationship so far between verses 1 and 2, and then verse 3 and 4 is just a series. So you'll kind of see how I did it. Lost the page. See how I did that? All right. Judging one another, you condemn yourself because you judge, practice the same things. And we know that God's judgment is according to the truth on those who practice those things. Next step in the argument. Now, do you think, O man, who judges those who practice such things and does the same to yourself, that you will escape the judgment of God? He's just kind of rephrasing the argument, repurposing it a little bit. So then the relationship between those two broad blocks of thought, you see them here and then here, it's just an advancing the argument. So we indicate that with an S, series of propositions. Now, if you notice just the whole sheet, what we're left with is verse 1, A, and verse 5. Those are the only propositions we haven't yet explained or linked together. I'd make the case that verse 1a, you're without excuse, O man, everyone who judges, is being grounded by verses 1 through 4. How do I know that? Because he is defending the idea that every man who judges is without excuse. Right? He's just saying, you judge without excuse. You condemn yourself because you practice these things. Therefore, you won't escape. Therefore, now you practice those things, do you think you'll actually escape God's judgment? Or do you pour contempt because you do not know that God's kindness leads to repentance? He's just defending. He's grounding the concept of verse 1a that every man who judges is without excuse. Now, it still leaves verse 5 hanging out there. What's the relationship between verses 1 through 4 and verse 5? Well, I would argue, and I think you can make a good case, that verse 5 is being grounded again by verses 1 through 4. So what I would say is that what Paul is doing is that verses 1 through 4 are the reasons that verse 5 is true. So again, we have, I think, what I'm calling a bilateral relationship. Okay, explain that in just a minute, but just look at what I've done. Make sure you can see that. Verse 1 is being grounded by verse 1b through verse 4. And then that's the grounds for verse 1a. The grounds for verse 1a is 1b through 4. And then the because verse 1 through 4 is true, verse 5 follows. It's the therefore. And when you have a grounds and a therefore relating the two clauses, you have a bilateral relationship. So verse 1 is true because of verse 1b through 4. Verse 5 is true because of verse 1b through 4. So hopefully that makes sense to you. Verse 5 is saying, because of your stubbornness and unrepentant heart, you're storing up for yourself wrath in the day of wrath and the revelation of the righteous judgment of God. I think verse 5 is just restating verses 1 through 4. Verse 5 is sort of a summary statement of the judger who practices the things that he condemns. So stubbornness and unrepentant heart leads to the storing up of wrath and revelation of the righteous judgment of God. So again, you're without excuse, O man, because you practice these things. And because you practice these things, you're storing up wrath for yourself on the day of judgment. Hope that makes sense. So again, the emphasis then of this text is falling in verse 1 through 4. You're without excuse because you are you're a hypocrite. You're practicing the things that you judge others for doing. And because you practice things you judge others for doing, you are storing up wrath on the day of judgment. So hopefully that makes sense. You see the relationship then between the clauses. I'm going to say it one more time. Lead phrase. You're without excuse. The one who judges is without excuse. Because you're practicing the same things that you're judging others for. And because you do that, you're storing up wrath for yourself on the day of judgment. If you'll notice, it's really the exact same phraseology from Romans 1:18-25. All the world's without excuse because they suppress the truth in unrighteousness. And because they suppress the truth in unrighteousness, Romans 1:24, there is wrath reserved for them at the revelation of the righteous judgment of God. Almost the exact same patterns in chapter 2, 1 through 5, as is verse 1:18-25. One last comment I hope you can see. That Paul is building and structuring his argument to suggest that the whole world is accountable before God. It's an amazing, slow, powerful case that Paul makes, not only against the Jew but the Gentile. And so it's a dynamic way of ordering the text. And these bilaterals, although they're hard to detect and sort of confusing, are emphasizing really critical truths for why the world is accountable and why the one who has the law is still accountable before God. So I hope that this is making sense a little bit better. I think as we get into Romans 3 and 4 and so on, you're going to get more proficient in these exercises. All right, that's it, and that's all I've got for you today. Hopefully that helps a little bit in your tracing.